All right, our guest speaker for this evening is our very own Dr. Rosalie Bunn, who's going to speak to us about the 50th anniversary of the University of Newcastle's Open Foundation program, which has given a lot of people the opportunity to go to university. Rosalie has been involved with the Open Foundation for, I think it was 21 years, I believe, Rosalie. Yeah, and I'm going to read the next bit because otherwise I'm going to leave something out. Rosalie taught social inquiry in the Open Foundation program for 21 years. She has an honours degree in sociology, a diploma of education, a master's by research in education and sociology, a graduate certificate in the practice of tertiary teaching, and a PhD in history. Most importantly of all, Rosalie sits on our management committee here at Newcastle Family History Society as our Vice President, our much appreciated Vice President. And tonight, Rosalie is going to talk to us about the Open Foundation.
Welcome, everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge our Indigenous Australians and pay my respects to them. Now, most of you would be familiar with what the Open Foundation is, but for those of you who aren't, it's a tertiary entry program that's one of the largest and longest running such programs in Australia. So I thought it might be helpful to explain how I became involved with Open Foundation, because I think I'm fairly typical of the students that were in the program. I missed getting a place at the University of Newcastle when I did my HSC. I was accepted into what was then the Canberra College of Advanced Education to do media studies, but I wasn't in a position to relocate to Canberra. So instead I went into the public service, into the Department of Immigration for 5 years. And I remained with them until I left to raise my family. But I guess I was always keen to further my education, and I returned to study when the youngest of my 4 children went to preschool 2 days a week, and I did the part-time course over the full year. When I collected some data from my PhD, I thought it might be interesting for you to know the range of educational qualifications that people previously had. So in my data, there were 3 people who'd only gone to year 7 in high school, another 4 to year 8, 14 to year 9. So what you can see from that table is that there was almost, well, more than 45% of people had only studied to year 10. So it was quite a diverse range. If you can imagine being a teacher in that program and having to cater to people, you know, with that range of educational backgrounds, it wasn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. But I loved it. So when I enrolled, I studied English literature, and that's with Dr. Jean Talbot, that some of you may have known, and social inquiry with John Collins. So I knew what it felt like to be a student in the program. I'd experienced the academic rigour, the adjustments that had to be made to fit into university life, and also the adjustments and accommodations you had to make in your own family life. So, you know, the late nights completing assignments and time spent researching and so on. So what I found from the people that I knew was that they were pretty dedicated to the program once they got involved as a student. I do recall there was one student that I taught who used to travel down on a motorbike from Kalongaluk. So, and she was doing the night course, so she would have left in daylight, but she wouldn't have finished her studies until 9 o'clock at night, and then drove on a bike all the way back. So that particular student became a social worker, and she was quite characteristic, I guess, of a lot of the people who were very dedicated to the program and went on to do very interesting things. So for me, that experience of being a student allowed me to interact with and observe some people who are relevant to developing Open Foundation. I went on to do an arts degree, at the end of which I was awarded a summer scholarship and invited to do honours in sociology and history, and I chose sociology. Then I did a dip ed, thinking I might go into teaching, but I was offered another scholarship to do my master's in education, and I worked on a research project relating to power relations in pedagogy, which was very interesting. While I was doing that, I was invited to become a tutor in sociology, and I did that from 1992 to 96. And then in 1996, I was also invited to become a casual lecturer, and later a course coordinator in social inquiry. So the subject that I'd gone in to study, I ended up being the third coordinator of that particular course in the program. So in that capacity as a lecturer, I was hearing stories about where my students were ending up, and I found them quite inspirational. I felt they needed to be told, but I was also aware that there was no comprehensive studies of Open Foundation that had been undertaken apart from Associate Professor Jo May's work, A Child of Change, the establishment of Open Foundation. Now, Jo's work, and Jo incidentally was one of my supervisors too. My other supervisor, you're going to have to be a speaker next month, Associate Professor Nancy Cushing. But Jo's work provided a documentary history of the early years of Open Foundation based on the archival material that she was able to locate. So what I was hoping to add to that knowledge base was oral histories. I wanted to get to the horse's mouth. I wanted to speak to the key players that I'd seen walking the corridors of the McMullen building. I didn't want an institutional history as such. I wanted oral histories and people's lived experiences. So my PhD included 38 oral histories with a chancellor, a vice-chancellor, deputy vice-chancellors, directors, lecturers, administrators, learning support staff and counsellors. And in addition to that, I collected 350 surveys from students. And that included qualitative and quantitative responses, so I could get some stats out of it, but also those stories of where the students did end up, that was so important, you know, to my aims. So hence the subject matter of my PhD was about the history and impacts, plural, of the program. So going to the people that I spoke to, the wonderful Dr. Jean Talbot, in her interview data, she said, well, Open Foundation was the brainchild of Dr. Brian Smith, and he didn't think the program would last very long. He thought very soon they would use up the pool of suitable people. But it was his idea, and there were people out there in the community who hadn't had the chance to go to university. He'd be amazed to know how it grew. But that was inspirational, really, of him to have thought of it. One of the other interesting things that happened along the way was when people who knew Brian Smith spoke about him, they started speaking with his English accent as if they were Brian. It was like Brian was being channeled directly to me. It was the most wonderful thing, and Jean was one of the people that did that. I also spoke to Chancellor Professor Trevor Waring, and I said to him, well, what impact do you think Open Foundation's had on the Hunter and Central Coast regions? And he said, when you think of the large number of people who've gone through the program, then clearly it's had a greater impact than the Hunter and Central Coast regions appreciate. And we probably ought to be doing more to let them know that we're really developing a human resource that will benefit their communities. So one can't quantify it, but one can certainly speculate that it's quite immense. So I asked him, well, when you talk to people in the community, have you had any conversations with them about Open Foundation? And I actually knew that he did, because Trevor and I used to have lots of talks about the program, because he himself was a mature age student. He left school at 14, went to TAFE and came back to university through that pathway. So his answer to my question was yes. And it's interesting really, because there's sometimes, well, most people are extraordinarily supportive, and they actually say, I'm going to do the Open Foundation program. And he said, in my clinical practice as a clinical psychologist, frequently there were patients that you could encourage to go to university and they'd say, oh, I didn't finish school, etc. And when they learnt that there was a pathway, I mean, again, it just was transformative and they'd frequently take that option. The myths that needed to be dispelled turned on the idea that these were people that would use resources that would otherwise have been available to genuine students and those sorts of things. Is that they need to be dispelled so that people realise that isn't the case. So in order to explain the significance of Open Foundation, I want to take you back to the higher education context prior to the establishment of Open Foundation in 1974. So previously, entry would have been through matriculation. So you would have been doing a high school certificate. There were some other rarely used means that have been available to us. There was a thing called the STAT test, the Special Tertiary Admission Test. And there were other initiative entry schemes that allowed people by interview to put their work experience forward to bypass the HSC. But in general, it was kids, you know, having to sit their HSC, and that was the traditional means of entry. Now, in Australia, by the mid-1960s, there were concerns within federal governments that university education was not being made available as widely as it should be. So in 1964, there was a committee called the Martin Committee who reported to the Menzies government on the low participation of women, for example, in higher education, and particularly women in sciences. Now, most of you would know that in 1965, the University of Newcastle became autonomous from the University of New South Wales. And I might add, tying into Rod Noble's talk last month, that Newcastle Trades Hall Council had been advocating for improved outcomes for workers in the region and for the establishment of a university as far back as the 1940s. And they argued that higher education had a role to play in a new social order, where there'd be complete and free education to all. And it was felt that working class children should have the same educational privileges as those given to the rich. So the connection between workers, advocates and the university was in existence long before the University of Newcastle itself. So what happened was that in 1970, there was a committee put together. It was seen that there was local commitment to the idea of promoting intellectual capital and a desire on the part of the University of Newcastle to initiate stronger ties with its community. So these aims were explored by this committee chaired by Professor Laurie Short, who I was able to interview. Laurie's also passed away, so I was very lucky to be able to talk to him. And the committee was given the task of advancing adult education within the university with a view to collaborating with existing adult education providers. And you'll note there that there were some other quite famous participants. Dr. Doniella from philosophy, Mr. Flowers, you know, there's the Flowers room in the Opportunity Library, Professor Keats, Professor Newton-John, and Associate Professor Ritchie. So there was a group of very committed people who had a bit of influence, I guess. So at the same time, there were other initiatives taken by the science, engineering and commerce faculties who were organising short continuing professional education courses to update or improve professional managerial skills in Newcastle business and industry. Interestingly, in the case of Professor Short, he'd previously been the director of the Educational Research Unit at UNSW. And in the late 60s, he wrote an article in a journal called The Australian University, in which he stressed the importance of higher levels of education in the form of skilled resources to meet the needs of a developing country like Australia. He positioned his argument within the context of Australia as a former colonial nation. And he argued that a measure of independence, economic, technological and cultural advancement would be achieved through adequate education provision. And in his view, this was to be provided not on the basis of the class into which one was born, but as an instrument of social mobility by which people could advance according to their own merits. Now, Short's argument was very much concerned with future directions for Australian education, in which the power of education played a pivotal role and was a continuing process throughout your life. So he stated, I believe that the strong demand for higher education should be regarded as a major national asset and an opportunity to contribute both to national development and individual fulfilment. So in fact, two reports were presented by Laurie's committee, the first in 1970, second one in 1972, that recommended that a new department be established to provide refresher courses, present public lectures, undertake research and development projects, promote theatre, music, the arts, and offer other courses similar to those offered by the Workers' Education Australia, WEA. Now, WEA had been in operation in Sydney since 1913 with the aim of developing knowledge, understanding and skills through a range of stimulating and varied educational activities. So following its terms of reference, the 1972 report recommended that the University of Newcastle's participation in adult education as an opportunity for members of the community to receive instruction at or near the level of university undergraduate courses be undertaken. So the emphasis on our university providing a community service was highlighted in its name, community programs. But that undertaking was also aimed at community development. And the report indicated that previously collaboration with WEA was on the basis of our university providing the academic input and the WEA, the administrative aspects of organising the courses. So the courses were weekly, 2 hours duration across a 10-week term. And these collaborative courses were pre-courses to the Open Foundation, were run at locations other than the university. So they took them out to places like Toronto, Muswellbrook, Gosford, and later Singleton and Cessnock. So special mention was made of a program to meet the needs of executive staff at the BHP Steelworks, funded by the BHP, with the aim of advancing the academic knowledge of graduate officers in BHP. So that connection was to prove quite useful in the late 1990s when BHP made the decision to close down and staff were encouraged to enrol in Open Foundation as a means of retraining and seeking alternative employment. Now, another initiative, the short report also signalled collaboration with the ABC radio and television, as well as the local television station NBN, Channel 3, to develop adult education material. That was put in place in 1978 when an attempt to run open university-like distance courses taught by Dr. John Turner in history and Dr. Jean Talbot in English literature was made through 2NURFM, the university's radio station. The short report envisaged making lectures available through the Hunter Valley region to Taree, to Woy Woy, inland to Murrurundi, Gloucester, Nabiac, Costa, as long as they didn't encroach on the University of New England, based in Armidale, but they spread out, quite a distance. So the new Community Programs Department was not to be organised in the usual pattern of academic departments. Instead, the short report recommended more broadly defined educational activities, which would be headed by a director and would be paid at the level of associate or full professor. The director was to be an ex officio member of Academic Senate and executive officer of a board of community programs, which would be under the control of the Senate. The framework of the department was to be endorsed by Senate and University Council, and the director was to work with heads of departments and university staff. The report acknowledged commitment to current staff attached to the University of Sydney's Department of Adult Education, who are currently working in Newcastle. And that's where the wonderful John Turner and later Margaret Henry came into the story. It was therefore recommended that these staff be offered appointment in the new department, and on that basis, Dr. John Turner, who occupied one of the University of Sydney positions, was offered acting directorship until a permanent appointment could be made. So 3 other academic staff were also to be appointed, along with an administrative assistant at the level of graduate clerk. At the same time, it's interesting to think about the national context. So again, 1974 was the start of Open Foundation. But of course, nationally, 1972 to 75 was the Whitlam Labor government in power. And they were particularly interested in the massive expansion of the higher education sector. And they had the intention of making higher education more responsive to national economic objectives. So the 2 things were happening simultaneously. So May and Bunn argue that the theme of equality of opportunity became a political policy when it abolished university fees in 1974 and opening university access to a wider range of people who otherwise wouldn't have contemplated a university career. This coincided with the University of Newcastle's initiative to include a larger component of non-traditional students among its ranks and the establishment of Open Foundation. Now, in his history of the University of Newcastle, Don Wright, who was one of the history lecturers in the faculties, expressed some surprise that the committee's recommendations were so readily accepted. He said, a little miraculously, this imaginative set of recommendations, which came largely from the pen of Laurie Shaw, survived Senate and Council almost unscathed, and the machinery was set in place. By adopting this approach to adult education, the university was emphasising its regional role. The university appointed Dr. Brian Smith, an able, imaginative, and occasionally provoking man, as the Department of Community Programs. Interestingly, in the data, one of my former colleagues who had been a student in the very early days of the program noted that Brian was very much in demand, and often people would contemplate consulting Brian about any matter of university issue. And she said it was like Brian was the Buddha, and people would go to consult the Buddha because Brian was the one that would know, what the answer would be. So I had the opportunity to interview Sybil Smith, who was Brian's wife. So I got a lot of insider details about Brian and his life. He'd been in the Merchant Navy and, his career and how it unfolded and so on. So I was very lucky to be able to talk with her as well. So Dr. Brian Smith was himself a mature age student. He'd worked at the University of Western Australia in their extension program. He'd also spent a year on sabbatical from the UWA undertaking research on adult education provision in Britain, Denmark, Holland and Belgium. And in addition, he'd been an organiser of the Festival of Perth, so he came with an array of relevant skills. John Collins was appointed as senior tutor and later became the director of community programs following Brian, and recalled some of the conversations that he had with Brian Smith about his motivations for establishing Open Foundation and about the research that Brian had conducted in Europe, which stimulated his thinking about the best way forward for the program. So John said that Brian had been most impressed by the Open University in Britain, and especially their entry requirements or lack of them. He'd also been impressed by the German Open University based in Hagen, the Paris 8 campus of the University of Paris, and the Free University of Amsterdam. And John said he was especially impressed with the way in which these alternative universities have been established. He commented, and Brian was of a mind to do something similar in Australia, and his first step towards that was a course which allowed anybody who took a liking or had an inkling that they might wish to do further study, allowed them to get started and gave them some support and assistance to the point where they would learn whether or not they were suited for and or liked higher studies. And that was the background to it. That's where Brian was coming from. So here's a picture of Brian. Does anybody in the audience happen to have known Brian Smith? Because that suit that he's wearing there was what you always saw him in. He was incredibly charismatic guy. And according to his wife, he used to make his own bow ties. So he had a little pattern for these bow ties, and he'd pick all this very interesting material and make his own bow ties and wear them to uni. Fascinating guy. So, and he always had a cigarette in his hand too, and probably the other stuff on the table had a part in, you know, some of his social occasions as well. So John Hill, who's on your right there, also recalled conversations with Brian Smith about the influence of the British Open University. And John Hill said, "I just think the Open University was in Brian's mind very clearly. Again, Brian was a man of the left. I think he would agree with my saying that, and I feel this was a sort of a left-wing movement. It was in England because it was created by the Labor government, the Wilson government, with the motivation of Lady Lee, the main figure who advocated the Open University in Britain. And I felt that this fitted in with Brian's philosophy of opening up the university to underprivileged people who'd missed out. It was a university of second chance. And this, I think, appealed to Brian. It was away from the elitist, narrow stream of British universities. And this appealed to Brian's thinking. And I think it was extremely important to him and his formulating of Open Foundation." So here's a picture of the two Johns and Brian. That was a photograph that was taken from the archives and put on the 20-year anniversary invitation. Here's some of the early staff. So there's Brian again with the glasses on the left, and Jean Talbot, and I guess they were doing something with the radio program, because they're talking into speakers there. Here's Norman and Jean Talbot, who was so instrumental in the program. Norman, of course, was in the faculty of English literature, but he used to lend his assistance, and Jean was one of the lecturers from early times. There's another picture which I was given permission from cultural collections to use. So there's the two Johns again. There's some of the administrative staff, and Jan Watkins and Sheila Winsley, but also Bethia Penglaze, the lady with the glasses. She became a coordinator of the Open Foundation after John had left. So I'll take you now to the influence of the Vice-Chancellors, because James Auchmuty was the Vice-Chancellor when Open Foundation was being established. And I think it's fair to say he was not necessarily a friend of the program. So it wasn't clear sailing in the early days. And Terry Ryan, who some of you may know from the Classics Department, who also lectured in Open Foundation in those early years, commented on the approaches of the two earliest Vice-Chancellors, whose job it was to oversee Open Foundation. And he said that Auchmuty was the Foundation Vice-Chancellor, a civilised human being in every sense. Auchmuty was an historian and believed that the humanities were first and foremost in his university. His successor, Don George, wasn't from that background, but there were those who feared that once Auchmuty went, the times were a-changing, long after Dillon sang that. Certainly, universities and funding, once Whitlam fell and we had the dark years of the Liberal Fraser government, and Fraser threw nothing at the universities, whereas Menzies and Whitlam had. But after Whitlam, universities were a low priority of the coalition, and therefore the problem for Vice-Chancellors was what they could do to support this program was somewhat limited, especially since the university kept growing and the funding didn't always match that. So I didn't envy the new Vice-Chancellor coming in, but I thought Don George did a very good job. Respondents who were present in the early years indicated there was also a bit of tension in the relationship between Auchmuty and Brian Smith about giving approval to admit students into the undergraduate program at the university who'd successfully passed Open Foundation. So John Collins recalled that resistance to the democratic impulses of the Open Foundation were that the University of Newcastle was not quite so, and then he laughed. He said, so keen on the rabble coming in, so the ones that hadn't come through the traditional pathways. And he said there was enormous resistance to the establishment of the Open Foundation course at the time. And J.J. Ochmuty, Vice-Chancellor at the time, kept delaying decisions that Brian had been asking him to make about whether or not the students at the end of the course would be allowed access or entry to the university. So, and he said, I've forgotten now when it happened, but when Brian still didn't get an answer, he advertised, and much laughter came from John at that point in the interview. So what Brian advertised was that people would be allowed entry at the successful completion of their course. And he said that rather forced the university's hand. But he said, unfortunately, Brian suffered somewhat for this. He was given a rollicking carpeting by the Vice-Chancellor. I think it was Ochmuty laying down the law about who was boss and what Brian's place in the universe was. But by that time, Brian wasn't alone. He had others, and as a wet behind the ears senior tutor, I wasn't of much use to him. But the professor of philosophy, there were others too, and I think Bill Warren might even have been one of them, who had some standing in the university, were behind the plan as Brian had described it to them. So I guess that had given Brian the confidence to advertise that it was all going to be the way he thought it was going to be. So you could say that Brian Smith's aspirations to open access was at odds with Professor Ochmuty's desire to protect the privileged place of the university. So here's Bill Warren and another early lecturer, Greg Preston, who both had lots of things to tell me about those early days. So in recollecting Dr. Smith's difficulties, Greg Preston also recalled that Brian Smith, once he became the director, undertook some intense lobbying with fellow academics to convince them of the merits of Open Foundation and gain their assistance in implementing it. He said very soon after Smith arrived, he began lobbying, and ultimately it only took a year for him to get Open Foundation started against some considerable opposition in some places. But clearly, Greg said, there must have been some support in equally important places as well. He said, I was a student back then and had some vague awareness of these developments. I know that Brian talked to a number of academics, I guess trying to persuade them to come on board with the idea, and he hoped that some of them would, out of the goodness of their hearts, be involved in teaching this program and developing it. So one of those people who was supportive was Godfrey Tanner. And that image you've got there was on a T-shirt that Associate Professor Ralph Robertson had acquired somewhere. I thought it was quite cute and very characteristic of the way some of us would see Godfrey going about the university, particularly when he had his long socks and his sandals on and his shorts. Very charismatic fellow, but very supportive of the program. Two others who were vitally important to the Open Foundation program were Ralph, that I've already mentioned, and Dr. Carol Kavanagh. So despite that clash of ideologies between Dr. Smith and his comrades and those who wished to maintain the elitist line, Open Foundation persisted. The idea that universities should be open to a wider cross-section of the population was bearing fruit, and Brian's vision and the steps he took to put his convictions into practice were commented upon by Ralph, who said, and I think it's a tribute to Brian, that he could see the potential in people for someone to do a course like this and still succeed despite their disadvantages. And seeing this whole region as educationally deprived and that it needed a new impetus, not just a proposal, it needed someone to do something about it, not just social support. Interestingly, Ralph's passed away now too, unfortunately, but he was given a gift from some of his students that he taught in his philosophy course in Open Foundation. And so you can see they've drawn a nice little image on the front, and on the back there's a whole bunch of messages, and Ralph had kept that for years and years and years. He got it out to show me. And one of those messages says, and given, that he was a philosophy lecturer, truthfully, Ralph, You're wonderful. What is truth? Another one was, watch out for slippery slopes. Thanks for the new attitude. Another one said, a headache to you, Ralph. Another one said, mind, body, aha. So that was something that meant a lot to him, but it gives you some idea of, you know, the impact that, you know, some of these lecturers had on their students. There was also Terry that I've mentioned. He wanted me to put that picture on the left in the thesis, and I said, but that looks like Kenneth Branagh. And so I took a picture of him as well, which is more like the Terry that we know. But you know, he was very observant of things that were happening in those early days. So while Brian was responsible for conceptualising Open Foundation, Terry commented that Brian came here and he created the whole structure, but he did consult with us about what would make a good centrepiece, and he wanted it to be arts rather than the sciences or economics and so on. Those were the signed issues. In terms of how it started up, he was the driving force behind it, but he had some good allies. I mean, it was never a one-man band. So you had wonderful lecturers in the course, like Dr. Ruth Lunny and Dr. Jill Bauer. Ruth's a published author. She's written books with the University of Manchester Press about Marlowe, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare. So she's very highly regarded in those circles. Jill has written a history of donkeys. So Simpson and his donkey and so on are included. Really, really interesting people. So the program is very lucky to have them. So as Open Foundation expanded over the years, so too did the needs for learning and disability support. So Dr. Ruth Lunny commented that in addition to the enthusiastic commitment of staff to the program, enculturating students within the university environment as well as providing additional writing skills became vital. And certainly down to Rimba, where I taught for the majority of my time in the program, there was a team support where everybody collaborated to make sure that the students had, you know, what you regard as a student-centred learning approach. We all worked together. In terms of curriculum in the program, there was just a few subjects in the beginning due to the limited resources and the availability of teaching staff. Brian Smith persuaded some of his academic colleagues, people like Godfrey Tanner or Norman Talbot, to give lectures or take portions of the course to give students exposure to a high quality academic experience. And John Collins, who became a director, talked about the fact that they were offered two subjects. One was called Political Man, and I took a bit of time asking people about that subject, both people who had taught it and people who'd studied in it, because it was quite fascinating. And John said it was crudely based on the PPE of Oxford. He said, was it all Cambridge? The politics, philosophy and economics strand of disciplines. And he said, and I remember Ken Dutton and the professor of philosophy and Brian and other luminaries were engaged in teaching Political Man. And then there are a series of other classes. I think there might have been history with John Turner and English with, I'm not sure, Norm Talbot perhaps, or even Jean at that stage. I don't know. And John said, and as I recall, we also offered them tutorials in addition to the lectures. So Brian Smith's desire to design a curriculum that would appeal to mature age students included an interdisciplinary subject which aimed to provide foundations in Western knowledge, which would stimulate critical thinking in a range of disciplinary areas. But after the demise of that core subject, Political Man, students could choose any two subjects. Philosophy was one, and social inquiry and English literature, and a whole range of other choices that they could make. They also experimented with curriculum. They were quite innovative, in fact, and the flexibility and experimental nature of the course offerings was put to good effect in the 1980s by one of the lecturers in Australian history, Margaret Henry, who's a favourite of many of us as well. In fact, Margaret had been in the faculty and she and Dr. John Turner swapped positions. John went to the faculty and she came into Open Foundation. And I was able to interview Margaret prior to her death. And she recalled that Brian Smith didn't tell her what to do in her new Open Foundation subject. She said it was quite dynamic. She said, I just taught whatever I felt like teaching, really. It was like the beginning of my real knowledge of Australian history and politics. Margaret's dual responsibility was also to organise public lectures, and she invited her Open Foundation students along to those lectures. She recalled organising for Manning Clark, and we have Manning Clark's books on our shelves here, to come and give a lecture. And I became really good at putting out press releases and doing interviews on the radio. So, you know, there were these spin-offs. You met people. That was the other thing about Open Foundation. You could invite people. And I remember once Brian gave me permission to ask Faye Weldon, the feminist author, or so-called feminist author, but that's another story. So actually, I suppose you could say I benefited more from Open Foundation, and she laughed, benefited more than I gave. I did a thing mainly for my Open Foundation students. I did a forum on women in the press and invited Adele Foran, you know, the columnist in the Sydney Morning Herald, and David Williamson, who was a journalist. It was just an amazing event, and people still remember those forums. And then I organised another forum on women in politics, and my students all came to those things. They were really supportive. So I suppose really my philosophy of teaching was that I was enthusiastic, and I think I was able to convey my enthusiasm to the students, and they were enthusiastic. They sort of add to your experience. So yes, while I was in Open Foundation, I think I'd organised, I think probably the first one I did was Jocelyn Scutt, who was a celebrated feminist author, who then went on to become famous. And I contributed a couple of book chapters that she edited on women and divorce. Open Foundation students were provided with the opportunity then to see and to hear experts in these fields. And that exposure, you know, to people they may have only heard about or read about must have been incredibly exciting for them. Margaret also was instrumental in initiating a scholarship to an Open Foundation student. It was funded by the Women's Electoral Lobby, and that award was called the Ellen Rose Award, named after a former Open Foundation student. So that went on for a couple of years. So that was another initiative that was really worthwhile. Another initiative of Margaret's was the setting of an assignment in Australian history that required students to tape record interviews with local identities, transcribe and analyse the interviews, then write them up in essay form. Students were challenged, encouraged to deal with real-world issues, developed interview and essay writing skills, as well as oral presentation skills when presenting their project to the class. So that collection of tapes and transcriptions have since been placed in cultural collections and has become a really useful resource for local history research. So as needs dictated, the subject offerings changed, became more vocationally oriented, and were oriented to the needs of the faculties into which the students transition. So whether they're going into law or into economics or, and later that nursing, you know, was somewhere that attention was paid to. So all of that meant changes to Brian Smith's original objective of providing a liberal education, including compulsory study of history and politics. All of that changed over time. So Greg Preston, that I've mentioned, recalled there was a change of attitude in the 1980s. He said by the mid-1980s, when I sort of returned to the Senate, it was very much seen as an academic endeavour. It was seen as part of the fabric of the university. It was not seen as an experiment, but as something that was working, something that led to us having additional good students. So there was a change between the early 80s and certainly my first understandings of it in, say, the late 70s, when it was very much experimental, it's philanthropic, it's part of the university's outreach, whereas by the mid-80s it was now seen, I think, as more integral, a part of what was done. So lots of changes in the 70s and 80s, but it was intended to be fairly flexible as possible, to give people that chance to prove that they had a capacity for university study. So as time went on, there was, you know, lots of changes that occurred. Later, Professor Seamus Fagan came on board. That was after Ralph Robinson's directorship. And Professor Brian English was the DVC in charge of the program. So in the 1990s, that was a decade of considerable change, primarily the rationale for the Department of Community Programs, within which Open Foundation was embedded, moved away from community engagement and towards a more academic focus. So economic, structural and institutional changes, such as secure funding and recognition of a centre within the university, led to further modifications. Some were praised by staff and some were not. By the 2000s, conditions changed again as academic study of the field of enabling education developed, and staff involved in conducting research on enabling education, sharing it through publications and professional conferences, as well as joining the new Enabling Education Association that Seamus Fagan had proposed, all promoted enabling research nationally and internationally. We became a bit of a leader, I would say, because there was quite a lot of contributions from our staff in putting that research together. So the program continued to go from strength to strength, and my survey data revealed that word of mouth tended to be the major source of recruitment. So rather than advertising or some other means, it was people telling each other about it. Open Foundation's regional communities were beginning to hear stories of student success, and there was a distance program that was put in place. So Open Foundation was expanding its offerings and responding to both vocational needs of students and the wider desire for a better educated population. So it's continued to expand, and in fact the most recent data states that each year 20% of the University of Newcastle's undergraduate commencing students come to the university via an enabling pathway. So that proportion's even higher at regional locations such as the Central Coast, where about 25% of their students transition into undergrad. And overall, 13% of Australia's total Commonwealth-funded enabling students were in the Open Foundation program, and 85% of those enrolled in higher education upon completion of the program. So it grew like topsy, basically. So you might have had between 40 and 80 in the beginning, but by the time I left the program, you were having like 2,000 people, you know, some huge numbers. Yeah. So John Collins observed that the more successful Open Foundation became, the more it disrupted what was perceived as the traditional role of a university, because suddenly you're getting all of these students who are not coming through the traditional pathways, who are doing incredibly well. They're becoming university medal holders. They're, you know, people are ending up in all sorts of interesting destinations. There's, I'm thinking of one professor of criminology at Sydney University, another academic involved in gender studies at Sydney University. There was a lady became professor of nursing at Charles Sturt Uni. So another friend of mine was head of school in sociology at Southern Cross Uni. So you get people that are going into not only into academic careers, but into you know, lots of destinations. Professor Brian English noted that Open Foundation students were found to do better than those entering by the HSC. He said, once we got that evidence that HSC was not as good a predictor of performance at university as our own Open Foundation programs, then every faculty pretty much rolled over and accepted that we would have our own students come through. Because again, there was still some opposition. So they really had to look at the data. What was said was that these students were going and drinking at the Godfrey Tanner Bar, but in fact, that wasn't the case at all. So, you know, those kinds of anecdotes were disputed, but they were happening at the level of council and Senate and so on. So it was a bit unfortunate, I guess. Professor English noted that when students did drop out, it filtered them out in a non-hostile way. So people just stopped coming if they couldn't handle the work, or if they didn't like the environment and decided they wouldn't go to university. So it was a filter as well as a preparation. Another person who's been quite instrumental in Open Foundation's Dr. Barry Hodges. He did a wonderful study of attrition, and he said, I'm interested in discovering to what extent dropouts are something we can, as an institution, do something about, and to what extent we must simply accept as a natural part of the process. And so he worked in collaboration with other universities, and I think they decided that it is just a natural process. If there is a big dropout, it's not because there's a fault with the program, it's just the nature of the beast, I guess, that it's not for everybody. Open Foundation also evolved from distance to online. Students were required to access their lectures on Blackboard, which some of us will be very familiar with. In 2007, the Vice-Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence went to the Open Foundation program and to the staff for their dedication and commitment to teaching. And in addition, the Chancellor noted that some years there was quite a high proportion, as I said, of medal holders who'd come out of the program. So where initiatives have happened over time, things like re-educating jail inmates. There was a program where the Open Foundation would go into the jails, or the inmates would come to the university with the guard and sit in on the lectures. So that's really quite innovative, I think, and you know, I'm sure it would have helped those people a lot. So the impacts on people's lives have been immeasurable. I attempted to capture that in the 350 survey responses, but also in what lecturers and counsellors and so on were saying about the students, because it's really quite interesting to try and track their pathways. I thought you might just be, we're getting close to the end, interested in the reasons that people enrolled. So I had, as I said, 350, but some of those people gave a couple of different reasons. And the majority of them, nearly 40%, related to self-identity. So they'd say, you know, they needed me time, or they regretted that they hadn't studied earlier, or they wanted to prove that they could do it, those sorts of things. A lesser number were interested in career and economic stability. So you might think that would be the major reason, but it wasn't. The self-identity was the major reason. Some said it was the right time, so it was temporal, right time in their lives. But for some, about 10% of them, there'd been a disorienting dilemma. So something awful had happened to them. Their relationship had broken down, or someone had died, or they'd been diagnosed with an illness, or they'd lost their job or something like that. So that was quite interesting, that came out of the data as well. And then there were other external factors. So yeah, basically, I'm just nearing the end now, so I'll just jump to some of the amazing people that we've had working in the program. Jan Watkins and Di Rigney were administrators, and you know, had a lot to tell me about the characters involved in the program, but they did wonderful work with the students as well. Dr. Angela Cowan and Maureen Strazzari were my two mates. We're still very close friends. And again, these were working class girls who never expected to go to uni. Angela wrote her PhD thesis on, she called it Playing with Culture, where she did an observational study of young children and what they observed from the culture in terms of norms about gender, or about death, you know, things that you don't necessarily know they're taking on board, but she was able to do a study that pulled out some of the knowledges that very young children, 4 and 5 years of age, might have. Maureen did her honours degree in sociology in the Richmond scheme, and she was able to establish how care had devolved onto women as a consequence of mental institutions being closed down and care being administered in a different way. And then she went on, she was doing a PhD until her husband became quite ill, but she was looking at voluntary assisted dying, and she'd interviewed Philip Nitschke and said that we were 10 years behind, the Scandinavian models on that issue. So both of these girls who'd done some secretarial training after they left school never expected to end up. Maureen was a health sociologist, and she ended up coming on board with me and teaching. And Angela had also been social inquiry lecturer and coordinator before me. They had a reunion or celebration of 20 years, well, more than 20 years. So I was able to get a copy. Well, I actually attended that event, so I had a copy of the invitation. It had some of the characters that we've already talked about. Other initiatives that they had, you can see John Turner in the background there with Joe Whitehead, and Joe was a lecturer in earth science, and he took students on really amazing and very interesting excursions. In classical studies, we had a lecturer by the name of Ron Newton, who actually took the students overseas if they had a mind to go. I think it wasn't only for the students, the public could also get on board with this, but they were going to ancient Greece and Italy and having what looks to me like a really slap up interesting time with the destinations, and only $4,300. It would have been a nightmare to administer, I'd imagine, but it was a very innovative thing to be doing, and how wonderful for those people who got to go on it. So Terry Mather taught maths with, he was one of my colleagues. Michelle Challenor taught life sciences, so people that were going into nursing would have been assisted by her. Helene was another interview respondent. She taught linguistics, and Dr. Susan West, who I'm trying to get to come and be a speaker here. She wrote about bushrangers, but she taught Australian history. The current director and deputy director are Associate Professor Anna Bennett and Kathy Burgess. Kathy taught chemistry. And so we've got people who've actually come through and experienced the program themselves who are now heading it up. That was a group of us after one of the attainment ceremonies. From memory, the photographer said to us all to say cheeky monkey, and I was the only one who did. All the rest of them are looking quite composed, so not happy. I just thought I'd end with this quote by W.B. Yeats. He said, "Education's not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire." And I guess you can see in the stories of Open Foundation students, which we haven't had the opportunity to go through tonight, but they're really interesting, that was certainly the case. So once we moved into the research phase of our jobs, I'm not going to talk about these, they're book chapters that I've written, but you can see I've written quite a lot of stuff, journal articles, and also refereed conference papers about lots and lots of facets of the Open Foundation program. And so to bring us through to the 50 years, they've had an exhibition at the Callaghan campus, which just recently closed. And it's moved down to the Ourimbah campus now, but it's people like me, I guess, who have come through the program. And both of my daughters also did Open Foundation. They're teachers now. One's a high school teacher who works with special ed kids. And my youngest daughter is a preschool teacher. She works with autistic preschoolers. And so the university's put this exhibition together where that's my daughter right in the middle of the invitation. I got quite a surprise to see that when it arrived. But people like Dom Freestone at the top, he dove into a dam as a young man and became a paraplegic. So he was in a wheelchair. He came to Open Foundation and did visual art as one of his subjects. So that image behind him, my colleagues and I bought from him, and it's hanging over in the university. He did a kind of a Jackson Pollock design and went over it with his wheelchair with coloured paint on the bottom. It looks fantastic. You can only see a little bit of it there. That's wonderful. Jan McLeod has been one of our speakers. She did Open Foundation, talked to us just earlier, was it last year? About her research about her uncle's diaries from the war in New Guinea. But all of these people have amazing stories. So that's the end of it. If you've got any questions that you'd like to ask me, then I'd be very happy to try and help you find an answer.
Now, listening to the short movie came up, the first thing I noticed was that no representation of science at all.
Wow.
And I was interested then, listening to you talking, and finally, towards the end, you talked about maths being taught and things like that.
Absolutely. Maths was there fairly early on. They had a subject called Basic Quantitative Methodology, but it was oriented in a particular way for people that would go into commerce, I think. But then that evolved over time, and then they had basic maths, and they also had another one that was oriented, you know, in a different direction. So I suppose one of the features of the program is that it has adapted and changed over
I was a
time.
bit surprised because I thought that one of the things that people, particularly those who only finished year 7, for example, would be missing a lot of
Absolutely.
science.
Yes. Yeah, but it wasn't impossible, and some people who didn't have that experience did do those subjects, and you know, once they learned what they needed to do, they did quite well at them. Jude?
You didn't mention one of the stories that was always floating around, I heard, was the number of marriage breakups. Not before they went into Open Foundation, but after they went into Open Foundation.
Yes, well, as you know, Margaret Henry was particularly interested in that, and I'd have to say there was probably issues in those marriages before they did go in, but sometimes that was the awakening for a lot of women in particular, and yes, that was something that some of the data that I collected from the students did talk a little bit about that. Yeah, absolutely.
I was at uni doing my degree about that time, and I can vaguely remember somebody before Brian Smith doing some sort of community courses with sort of red hair and a sort of a reddish.
Are you sure it wasn't Brian?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure, but somehow the name doesn't fit somehow.
Yeah, I can't think of any other redheaded person.
Well, he was sort of redheaded.
Did he have a rusty coloured suit?
I can't remember. I can only remember vaguely the face.
Did he look like Wazzle Gummidge?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that was
So it
right.
probably was.
Yeah, a lot of people said that they could see that similarity.
But I mean, I couldn't, on the photo that you showed was not recognisable.
Yeah, well, they weren't very clear either. The one in the suit, Sybil gave to me, and you know, the focus probably.
So he was actually teaching before the official.
Well, he
Open
taught
Foundation.
philosophy, and so he wanted to be involved firsthand, you know, in the programs.
Despite its wonderful success, my impression was always that it was under threat
Yes.
for a long time, and that always amazed me. Maybe that was before they did research and before they figured out how many people from Open Foundations actually went into uni. Was that your impression?
That was
as well?
definitely the case. Part of my thesis, I talk about an economic rationalist experiment
Yes.
that they undertook, and I took it out because it may have seemed a bit provocative on my part, but there was very much a money-oriented sort of direction that they wanted profit to be made from the program.
Because it was free, wasn't it?
It was, well, in the early days, you had to pay like $65 or something to do the course. So there was money. John Collins talked about money in brown paper bags being handed over. But it was people actually paying cash to do the courses, and it wasn't until much later that it became federally funded.
Mhm.
But yes, there have been threats along the way. But the thing is, it became so popular that the university really couldn't
Yeah.
deny it. And also, as I mentioned, you know, there were a lot of supporters across the university who were fairly high-ranking people.
Mhm.
And so I think if Brian ever got himself into difficulties, he would rely on those people to, you know, to back him up.
I always thought Brian was one of the people who was, when he moved up the ladder, was kind of interested in maybe cutting it. But that was your impression?
Well, he did think it would run out. He didn't think there'd be enough people to sustain it over time.
Right.
But that turned out not to be the case at all.
Mhm. This is Brian English.
Oh, you're talking Brian?
Yeah.
Brian Smith.
No, I'm talking about English.
Brian English was very supportive of the program, and in fact, it aligned very much with his philosophy in social work. That Newcastle was an innovative university,
Yeah.
and he said if you were going to make changes, ours was the university that you would do it in, because there was that capacity for them to take new ideas on board.
Yeah.
The medical school started sort of in the late 70s, didn't it? So at Newcastle Uni, and that was an innovative medical school.
Yes, it was.
So, and they were taking people through not just their high school certificate mark, but also an interviews and
Yes.
other studies. So it must have been a decade. It did seem like a decade of innovation at Newcastle Uni.
Yeah, I think if you were looking at the university as a whole, you know, you'd be pulling those sorts of things out. But people did indicate that the medical school and Open Foundation was possibly two of the best things that the university had done, because they were going against the grain that, you know, the idea that university students needed to come through the traditional pathways, and that was being disproven, in fact. Jim, did you have a question?
Newcastle is well known for this program now, and has been for a long time. Where other universities in Australia doing anything similar?
Absolutely, and in fact, we can't claim to be the first one, because Brian had been involved in University of WA's program that was, yeah, a bit similar. He was playing around with something over there before he was appointed here. But most major universities have similar programs, but they certainly don't have them in the numbers that we have them. So I think I said in that presentation, 13% in one particular, I think 2016, 13% of the whole federal budget for enabling programs was coming to our university. So, other universities did have them, but we have the student numbers to sustain.
And a lot of the others would have started later.
Yes, yes.
So they have made a big impact probably on Newcastle's education levels.
I think so. One of the things in my thesis that I wanted to look at was impacts on individuals, impacts on the university itself, impacts on the region in which it was taught, because the Central Coast, for example, has very high rates of disadvantage. So if you've got people going to that university and 25% of them, are going into undergraduate programs from that kind of environment, then that's hugely significant, I think.
You would have seen a wonderful transformation in some of your students. I remember I did tertiary preparation certificate at TAFE once, and within 6 months of teaching them, some of those students just changed physically as well as mentally. And then before, they would come in very shy and not question anything. By the end, you couldn't shut them up.
Yeah.
They were questioning everything.
Yeah.
And it did lead to breakups because they changed that whole character.
Yeah. I was going to write a paper and do some research with one of your former colleagues, Cher Campbell.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And being a lecturer in law, she noticed that students who'd come through the Open Foundation program had more emotional intelligence
Yeah.
than some of the younger students, and so their adaptation into, you know, sort of the legal field, she felt was enhanced by them having, you know, been a mature student and come through the program.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't get time to do that with her, and then we both retired, we got old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a proper thank you to you, Rosalie. That's the most comprehensive overview. Fabulous to know the background. And so interesting. Quite a lot of comments about the maturity of those people coming into the program. I think it does sometimes make a big difference. Those coming straight out of university, and then other people coming in where they've had such a long life experience. Huge difference sometimes, not always, but quite often. Thank you. Brilliant.